Um, Thank you, André Hedetoft, for speaking with me today to discuss some elements around the ARC project, this AI screenwriting experiment that we are running. Your name has come up a lot when I started this project in various circles. Everyone said I should talk to you because of your experience as a filmmaker, your drive and your passion for working with AI in ways around filmmaking. So I thought since you're in Skåne and I'm in Skåne and we are kind of on this same path of learning this wild stuff together, we should have a conversation and be as deep as we can or as shallow as we want, and to try to add some context to a very complicated conversation, because right now, as I said, there isn't that much understanding around what it does for the creative community and what it can do for creative people. My first question is, so tell me exactly, Andre, what does your company do with AI specifically?
Well, I would say it's basically two different things, but it's all centered around. I mean, I'm a storyteller by heart. I've always loved, great stories in any shape or form I could get them, of course. But eventually, I fell in love with like the moving media of film and television and video games. So basically, what we are doing in a sense is that we're looking at how can you actually develop, story universes, intellectual property, and then, bring that to life in different forms, may that be film or television or video games, together with different partners. So that's one thing that we're, actively working on, a series of this IP and story universes. And then the other part is also like an interest in seeing if, we can do it ourselves, of course, but how can we put more of that power in anyone's hands so that they can bring their own fantasies and stories and worlds to life. And we're looking at how you can actually combine that into all the way into game engines. So basically you can talk to the AI and then bring that to life inside of your own 3D digital world and video game, basically. The unifying factor in all of this is, of course, like, how can we, anyone, both us and anyone, tell better stories and bring them to life? Because I think what drives me in all of this, and has for a really long time, is more or less this quote around, before we can build the world we want to live in, we have to imagine it. Yeah. So I believe, bringing more stories out into the world, more fantasies about, humanity's future and all of that, that's going to give us better ideas. And once we have those ideas, people can get inspired and they can get to work and they can build companies around them and start bringing that technology and the transition into a better future for all of us. That's, my main drive behind this. And I think looking back at history, humankind has always been inspired by, all sorts of stories, of course, but especially the field that I'm really interested in, which is science fiction, of like the stories of humanity's future based on where are we today and what world do we envision. And one anecdote is, of course, like if you look at Jules Verne wrote a book like in the beginning of 1900s around a couple of people going to the moon. And then more or less 100 years after, we actually set our foot there for real in a project that is spookily similar in many ways. I mean, not exactly, but so for me, I think discussing this idea around, creating stories that inspire humanity for something, for a better future. It's not something you can draw a direct line to. Like, I read that story, and because of that, I founded this company, and because of that, now we're on the moon. But you can see, if you look over like centuries or a bigger time perspective, you can actually see shifts coming from the stories we tell to stuff that's brought to life for real. And I found that, really, really fascinating. Good question. I'm not sure yet exactly. I would say that our process is basically looking a bit something like this, that we're developing our, like what we call our internal creative AI engine.
Right.
And that is, let's not go into that, but that's a collection of, a whole bunch of stuff. That's basically our playground, I would say. Like we're trying everything and a little bit more than that. Just to see like what can you actually do, what's possible, how can you use the tools that's already out there, how can you build your own, how can you combine things in new ways.
Wow.
Just to work with and have a play with AI. And the reason why it's internal is because I want to see what we can actually do with it on a slightly grander scale. Like how can we use that as a tool? Like humans have always used some sort of tool to, express their creativity. How can we use that as a tool to help us build, in a sense, more traditional stories? Like how can we build a show Bible for TV, or how can we, potentially write a pilot script, or how can we, develop a video game using those sort of tools? Just to see what's actually, what is the hype, what is the reality, and how can we, find what works for us in between. So we're developing, story universes, and then we're looking at, okay, how could our internal AI tools help us in different phases of such a project? Like you usually have an idea phase. You just want, a lot of different ideas and see what could potentially be something, and just have a play with that. That's like the first phase. And then you move into, okay, now I start to see the structure of this, the skeleton of the idea, and I've started to outline a bit. Now I want to really flesh that out into something a little bit deeper, just still in a development stage, still trying things out. And then more and more you're approaching like the stage of, okay, now we need something presentable to, be able to talk to our partners in the film, TV, and gaming industry and see like, okay, we have this really cool story world. We want to do something with it, and try to find the right partner for that project. So basically, I mean, our first part of this is we're developing a series of story universes, different IPs, really rich, expansive worlds for the most part that could potentially be, in any shape or form. It could be a book, it could be a film, it could be a TV series or a video game, or something in between. And while we're doing that, because that's more traditional work that, anyone, especially, I mean, I myself could just sit down and do that all by myself. But while we're doing that, we're looking at, okay, so how can we use AI and different kind of tools to help that process, to make that process more creative, more fun, especially. I'm not sure it's going to be a lot better. I can't say that the stories will be a lot better just because we're using those sort of tools, but I would say our process is going to be a lot better. It's going to be more fun for us. I myself going to get a lot of ideas that I didn't have before, because suddenly I have this writing partner just, taking things in a new direction, giving me new inspiration, and stuff like that. So, but we're still, having a play with that. So I'm not entirely sure what is going to come out of it, except whatever we like around that, we try to integrate in our own internal creative AI engine, which is basically a tool for developing story universes. And then the next part of it is what I'm saying. Like once we find things that work, then we can start to bring that into a lot bigger mass of people. And not just, I'm not, not just a couple of companies, but in the end goal for all of this is basically, anyone, my daughters or anyone could sit down in front of the tooling we're developing and actually help them to bring their own stories or universes to life. To take one example, what if what if anyone could sit down in, on their iPad or cell phone or in front of their computer, and just enter like usually I talk about this white room from the Matrix. You're dropped down into a totally empty space, And now, instead of using regular tools like you used to, maybe like you need to know some 3D and you need to be able to place things in that world, and you need to, what if you could just talk to your AI companion and say, well, what do you want to do today? Well, I want to take a walk through the forest. Okay, and you start, actually, you're in this 3D world, you start to see it brought to life. Like, okay, there's a forest down there, I can walk into that. And now, as you continue to talk or write, you could either talk to it like you would a friend, or you could actually write a story if you prefer that sort of sense. And as you're writing the story or talking to it, the world is brought to life with these different things. So you're actually, more or less designing your own story in your own world. That's one example of, the kind of tooling that could be really interesting with this sort of stuff.
Wow.
And still, I would say, like, there's so many layers to that, because if you look at it like, okay, so you're developing a AAA game using that sort of tooling where everything needs to make perfect sense and have a coherency in the world and have a memory and have a guided experience. No, it's not ready for that. That's way far off. But if you're looking at it more like, maybe like Minecraft, like, okay, so I'm in this world, I want to have a play, I want to express my creativity and bring stuff to life, I want to be able to design it and tell my own story, and possibly invite my friends to experience that story with me. Then that's a lot more closer for where the tooling is today, I would say it's way too early to say. I think, like you're saying, like, where are we with this whole metaverse thing as a humanity? It's almost like trying to see, like, in the beginning of internet, like, how would that evolve? What could be possible? What will humans actually use it for? If you try to predict the trajectory of that really, really early on, we would probably have some ideas, but all of them would be probably wrong. So I think whenever someone starts talking about, like, okay, we're building the metaverse and stuff like that, I say that's a really good pitch, of course. But it's way too early, because there is so much tooling, so much different technology, so much different culture that needs to go into that to even remotely make that version work, I would say. You could, of course, build your own platforms like we have today on the web, and you can call them metaverse, but really, I think when you boil it down and try to see what is the metaverse, well, the metaverse in extension is like an alternative reality where you can move between, any reality within those digital spaces, and you can bring your own avatar and representation of yourself into any worlds. You can make money there. You could actually live and work in that environment. That is, at least the Snow Crash dystopian version, possibly, of the metaverse. But I mean, that's the definition of it. And I don't think anyone at this point today is really talking about that. I think most people, including Meta, are more talking about, okay, we're building our own platform where you exist in a 3D world and you can do some stuff in that. And for me, that's not super interesting. I think what's interesting for me, potentially, is to see, like, okay, the tools that we're developing around, how can we tell more and better and more creative stories for humanity? I think for us, it's more about finding the inflection point of, okay, so now that we know what works, how can we break something off that really excites us and bring that to a bigger mass? And for us as a company, it's too early to say. That's why I'm saying, like, that is one example where you can talk to an AI and bring a 3D world to life. But, before we're at that point, because that's going to be a couple of down years to line, before we're at that point, all of this, AI and natural language processing, it's all text in the beginning. Like, so how can we actually potentially, like, the next step for us is probably how can we start there to help people, co-write stories with an AI, or use it as a better version of, autocomplete, where instead of just filling out 2 words for you, it can, write a sentence for you or give you an idea that you haven't thought about. I think that's the next step. And then maybe down the line somewhere, as technology matures, as the potentially metaverse matures, we could probably find a whole new suite of creative tools for anyone to, have a play with. And people are going to have a play with it. As we always have done it. When a new technology comes that's, available for a lot of people, especially for people that maybe couldn't use that kind of stuff before, they're going to have a play with it. And we have no idea what they're going to create with it. And that's an exciting prospect. But it's a longer one. I think the step for us is basically we're developing story universes, we're bringing the tooling, and then we're seeing how can we find like 1 or 2 or 3 things there that's really interesting in the near-term future that could help people tell their stories. Yeah. No, I mean, for our part, mostly it's basically our own process, mainly internally. So what we're doing is of course writing a lot with these tools, and that we're doing ourselves. And then we're having a play with game engines such as Unreal Engine to see like, okay, if we try to combine that technology with the game engine to bring stuff to life around you, what could you potentially do there? But we're doing most of that internally, to be fair. So I would say one thing, I mean, you could approach this from 2 different ways. You could approach it from like, okay, like we did in the beginning, I should say, I should be honest about that. Like when we started FunStuff, basically, we said like, okay, we're really excited about this prospect of creating story universes that could, have at least a core of something that could inspire, the future of humanity. So let's go do that. And around that point, when we started FunStuff, natural language processing started to become a thing. These different models and technologies actually started to be able to give output so good, so people started to see that there might be something there. It was still really early days. It was 2 years ago, I think. It was still very early days, but there was, that sense of, okay, maybe there's something there. So we started to dive into AI, learning that, having a look at all the tooling out there, and trying to see, just having a play with it and see, okay, could we use this as another tool in our toolbox while creating stories and universes? And I'm saying this because I think there's 2 ways you can approach this. You can approach it with like, okay, here's some new cool technology. What can we do with it? And we have experimented with that a lot. And we found some things where the ideas we had in the beginning for 2 years ago, they didn't work at all. But then when we actually started to try it, we got some new ideas and we see what was possible and how you could shape that. So we have done a lot of that where you just have played with technology to see, okay, what can we do with this? It's like children getting a new toy. And as we mature, I would say more where we are today, mainly, is trying to flip that the other way around. Like, okay, the end goal, or not the end goal, but our current goal at least, is to bring these story universes to life. We do that in two stages. We build the IP internally, and then we partner up with the right people for that IP to bring that to life. So we're not a production company that produces films or TV or games.
Okay.
But we're building IPs. We're partnering up with different partners, and then together we bring that to life. And while we're doing that, I try to flip the AI question on the other way around and say, okay, so we're already doing this. We're doing it. We could do it manually. I mean, we could, I could work with the concept artists to bring those worlds to life. We could present them. But how can we use everything we learned during these 2 years while developing, our internal AI engine, having a play with all these different tools? How can we use the stuff that actually worked in that process to help us to do that? Maybe faster. I mean, it's usually faster, but at least a lot more fun and creative. And I can't really say are these stories better? I'm not sure. Are they a lot better than if I just sat down and wrote them? I'm not sure. But what I do know at least is I get a lot of ideas, and we get a lot of ideas that we wouldn't have if we haven't used the tooling. Because now it's suddenly not just ourselves alone. We're suddenly having this writing partner that sometimes is completely crazy and drives us in a direction that we don't want to go. Sometimes is really deterministic and cliched, but sometimes as well gives us hints of inspiration, new ways to go with story, different development of characters or worlds or story events. And I think we still have a lot of work to do, but I think the process of doing that, it's like always having access to a writing partner or how many writing partners you want, and always
having a writing room,
juggle, having a whole room of them, juggle things around and having a play with that and see what comes out. We're doing everything, I would say. I mean, we're obviously we're using all the toolings that's out there. We're having a play with GPT-3. We have a collaboration with Hugging Face, which hosts a whole bunch of models like GPT-G and GPT-Neo and all of that stuff. So we're trying whatever's out there. We're training our own models and having a play with that as well. So we haven't ruled anything out, and I must say we haven't found the perfect combination either. But I mean, for us, it's basically around what model can do the best job at the moment. So I mean, if you just want really quick ideas, then you could have a model that is super great at pitching you log lines of crazy stuff, for example, and then you can start choosing and combining them. But if you want someone that's more akin to maybe okay, so now we found a character, we want to develop this character called Amy. Okay, then potentially you want a model that speaks in a different language around how do you develop a character and stuff like that. And as you said, if you want a model that can actually write the screenplay with you, then these models are mainly a combination of two things: what you're trained them on, of course, and they're gonna look at that patterns. They don't understand those patterns, but they're gonna have a look at that and do their magic to in the end give you something similar. So you can train them on that, and you can use prompt engineering and different parameters to get the output you're looking for with these different models. So I think, long story short, I don't think anyone has found it, perfect combination. I think there is a lot of room for these really big, huge models where you can, with a few shots prompting, you can get sort of the output that you want, and you can get widely different outputs from the same model. And I think those are great. But I also think there is room for really small models that's super tuned into one task you want. You want to be able to switch between them, as you do in any program. Like if you're in front of Photoshop, you don't have one tool, you have a whole bunch of tools that gets the work done. If you're having a play in Word or something, well, you don't have all those tools, but you still have different kind of tools for the different kind of jobs. And I think that's more the reality. There won't be like one. Right. We call it the creative AI engine because that's it's easier to talk about it like that. Yeah. It's a whole combination of different tools. And I think the generation of language is one thing. Like you have written something, and now you want the AI to continue on that or build that out, so that you have those generative models. That's usually what we talk about when we say like, okay, we want to write something with an AI. We're going to use an AI in creative works. But I think there's also a lot of room for different models around entities, for example. So we're having a lot of look around, okay, so if we have this text, can we have models that, go in and find entities like characters, locations, different world building elements? And if they find them, can it label those things in the text, for example? And if it can label them, can you actually send that information up to a new generative model to, give some new inputs around that? So I think speaking around AI in storytelling, I think generative models are a big part, but there are also a whole host of other models that are really helpful building out the worlds. How long do we have? No, I'm kidding.
Plenty of time.
So I would say basically there is a lot of misunderstandings. There is a lot of hype. There is a lot of fear around the subject, as it usually is when there is new technology.
Something new, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's true for a lot of industries, but especially the creative industries, because I think we as humans, of course, feel that the last outpost of any AI that we've seen in popular culture, at least, will be our own creativity. Like that is the only thing that the AI and robots can take for us. It's like our humanity and creativity. And now we're seeing these toolings, and we see a lot of hype, and we see a lot of misunderstandings. And I think that fear is very real. But I think, like you said, when you start having a play with it, it starts being a lot less scary. You start to understand where we are with it today. Where we are, in my sense, what I think is interesting is like, it's a tool. I mean, it's not, and we say it ourselves, creative AI engine, writing partner. I mean, we use those kind of metaphors to talk about it because it's helpful for ourselves. But I think at the end of the day, the way we look at it is basically fantastic. It's a tool that we humans can use, not to get rid of our creativity, not to outsource our creativity, but to strengthen it, to like, I call it like a creative superpower. Okay, so now suddenly I can sit with this tool, and now I can have better ideas. I can have more ideas. I can try out stuff faster. And as I'm doing that, I'm still shaping a story or universe or characters in my own sense. I have to do a lot of editing. It's not like I press a button and suddenly we have a universe. I'm doing the writing. The AI assists me or helps me or is there whenever I need, basically. I think that's, at least for where we are today, for me, that's a lot better way to talk about it.
Right.
I mean, it's not impossible. You could, of course, you could actually press a button and get a screenplay or a 300-page novel or whatever you want from it. But nobody's gonna want to read that. Not at the point where it is today. You could produce a lot of material, a lot of text, but no one's gonna want to read that. What most people react strongly to is obviously, it's some form of human viewpoint, human emotion, human ideas around, our current situations or a dramatic event or our future. That's the creativity that most humans resonates with. And that is not lost. I mean, when you went from the typewriter to a computer, you could suddenly, you have spell checking, and you could write, and you can even, potentially have some auto-completed words. That didn't remove your own creativity or the humanity in your stories. That only helped them. And AI is exactly the same. Like, okay, so now you're suddenly, instead of having it just auto-completes 2 words or spell check for you, now it can also give you some ideas. Fantastic. That's more or less the point where we are today. I'm not saying that down the line, there will probably be, of course, there's going to be a lot better models that maybe can do even more of that work. I think for me, what's interesting is not outsourcing our humanity, outsourcing our creativity. It's how can we strengthen it? I'm not sure, but I had some thoughts around it. But I would say that, firstly, I say that because that is, I know that's what drives me in the bigger picture. If out from the agenda of the day to day or week to week or so, I know that is something that drives me for the longer perspective. But it's also, I know saying that it's very dangerous. It's dangerous to put that on your own creativity as well. Like, okay, I want to help make the world a better place through my stories. Now suddenly, as soon as you said that, now you have put that on your creativity. That okay, so now you have to go to work. You have to make the world better through your
You have
story.
to change the world today with
exactly. So it's a very dangerous concept, and the way I deal with that, I think, is more or less like, okay, so any story, it doesn't have to be a documentary. It doesn't have to be perfect and show the perfect future of humanity. It just needs to have a direction or a theme that resonates with people in that sense of direction. What I mean with that, the stories that interest me most, at least, I mean, the trend is usually when we look at the future movies, there is a lot of dystopic stories, basically. And that's not strange, because those make for fantastic conflict and stories, and and struggle, and you need that sort of stuff to tell a good story.
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not saying that the stories I want to write should be just utopias and everything should be perfect and stuff like that. But I do think there is a direction of storytelling, especially looking at sci-fi, that's all looking at a dystopic future in a lot of ways. And I do think there is room for some optimism around those stories as well. With that said, usually when I start with the story universe, I'm not starting with like, okay, how can we change the world with the story?
Sure.
I have that somewhere in my mind, and eventually that theming usually comes true, through some character or the theme of the story or something. It usually solves itself. And I would say, going out for myself, I would say I do think that AI can help in that sense, because I do think that in many ways, all stories are interesting, even if they don't tell of the perfect future. Like I said before, I think before we can build the world, we need to have, we need to see it, we need to have ideas around it. And the more ideas we have, the better we could potentially make it. So I think the way I approach the notion of how can AI help us with that ultimate goal is basically, well, instead of just you and me, that could, we could just sit down and write this stuff ourselves, because we have, we've done that a lot. We have potentially that training, or like you said, watch a lot of movies, read a lot of scripts, and now, doing that. We could do it, but not anyone can do that today. But what if you have some tooling that could make, a lot of people that wouldn't do it otherwise tell stories from their perspective? That is something that's really interesting for me. Like, I'm looking at my own daughters, they're very young, but still, I would say that if I could get some tooling in their hands that could help them, create their own worlds or stories or characters that they couldn't do before, or needed years of training to be able to, understand a good story and how you tell that and develop characters. If I can help them do it, then suddenly we're going to have stories from people all over the world that wouldn't have brought them to life without that tooling. Absolutely. And I do think that is something that's super interesting for me as well. I love this quote around, I'm not sure who said it, but I read it somewhere along when, studying writing, where do you have the courage or something to bring forth the treasures within you? It's something like that. And I love that story, because I do think that's so true. Any person actually has a lot of treasure inside themselves. And if we can help them, be it in any way, shape, or form, even with AI, to help them bring that treasure forward, then that is something very exciting. That's a fascinating concept. I would say that, I mean, seeing the trajectory of the development in these 2 last years, and it's ramping up every month, I would say, of course, at some point, potentially even now or earlier in history, AI absolutely can produce, works that moves us, that feels superhuman, that brings us to laughter or to tears. That is absolutely possible. And while saying that, I also think that what is interesting for me is it's not this notion of, an AI that's creating on itself. I do think what's interesting for me at least is, okay, so we people, we're the creators. How can you use, this new technology or this tooling or whatever we want to do to heighten that, to help us? And I do think then you are the writer of that story, and you're using this as a tool to help you. That's the point of view that's, I think, is very fascinating. That doesn't mean that down the line there are probably going to be AI models that can, with very minimal input or just a prompt, actually produce works. And I do think it has already happened, but absolutely it will happen at some point. But I also do think there is a very important point around, okay, we're humans. Storytelling is our medium to communicate our thoughts, ideas, our fears, our humanity. That's what we want to use. Now, can we have some tools to help us do that, you know, easier or better? Fantastic.
Yeah.
I think OpenAI's chief scientist basically said that potentially these language models are already conscious. And he said maybe, to be fair.
Did.
Yeah. But I would say
Holy
I'm not
shit,
sure.
he said that already?
Yeah, he said that. It was a big tweet storm the other day around that sentence. And maybe that was, you know, maybe that was the reaction he wanted. I'm not sure. But I would say that that might happen or might not. I think we already have a really good solution to that, and that is to put ourselves as the, you know, the filter or the funnel that the information flows through. Because I think if we process it, if we're the editors, at least, if we're, you know, developing it, then you already have solved a lot of that. Because then it's if I'm using the tooling, then I'm going to inflict my viewpoint, my mortality, my emotions to it.
Exactly.
I do think that's a much quicker and maybe more fascinating way than trying to solve that problem with AI on itself. But we'll see. We'll see when GPT-4 comes out, and potentially it's already conscious.